So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, good citizens, one and all of Melbourne. Glorious Melbourne, UNESCO's second city of literature and Australia's centre of sport, fashion, theatre, comedy, street art, fine dining and late-night biffo. When the footy's not on the front page of the newspapers, another senseless nightclub stabbing is. Let's face it, Melbourne is to drunken street violence what Vatican City is to the Catholics. A Mecca. Now, take a lazy constitutional around our otherwise elegant central district, late on any Friday or Saturday night, and you'll see many sights. Dodgy buskers, whom Robert Doyle would like to ban on the basis that their repertoire does not include enough hits from the 50s, 60s and 70s, the last time he heard contemporary music. Legions of underdressed young ladies that you yearn to rush up to and thrust a cardigan around their shoulders so they won't get a chill on their kidneys. And you'll also enjoy a ringside view of Melbourne's finest young men and women in their physical prime, projectile vomiting, eye gouging, glassing, and engaging in vigorous games of 5 against 1, kick 'em in the head while they're down. We have, so far, failed to deal with this issue properly. For one thing, Australia has failed to get any of these disciplines recognised as Olympic sports. And we are thus unable to demonstrate our superiority on the international stage. For another, the City of Melbourne is inexplicably dragging its feet in making our world-class street violence a centrepiece of their promotional campaigns. Where, oh where, is the billboard campaign featuring a photo of a sultry Zac Efron lookalike in a white skin-tight blood-stained T-shirt with Melbourne 2:13 a.m. written underneath? But instead of capitalising on our superiority in the field, the hunt has been on for a solution, and predictably, all the solutions have been variations on send in the cops. Look, it's not that not having a 2 officers to every drunkard ratio isn't effective, but it's patently unsustainable, particularly given that after we've paid for the desal plant and pulling down any of Melbourne's buildings that are over 30 years old and replacing them with glass boxes, there's not enough left over for the cardboard boxes and past their use-by-date pot noodles for the homeless, let alone full-press policing. It's also locking the barn door long after the horse has made a Maccabee Diva-style bolt for freedom. Surely, our time and resources will be better spent on prevention. It seems that surely we would be better serviced by trying to work out what it is that our young people in the fresh blush of youth seem determined to get utterly rat-assed and act up like they were raised by brain-damaged hyenas. The traditional fish-in-the-barrel targets are parents and the licensing laws. Maybe it's them, maybe it's not. Plenty of young folk who behave catastrophically after 30 beers have perfectly lovely parents. And there are countries in Europe where bars are open until dawn and people just sit around and sip sangria without punching each other in the face. The last significant fiddling around with Melbourne's licensing laws nearly ended with every live music venue, none of which had any trouble with street violence, having to close their doors. It took several rallies and a media campaign to save the tote, which nearly died because it was required to hire about 17 bouncers every time it had a gig, even if, as was not uncommon, they outnumbered the punters. Maybe it's time to think outside the box vis-a-vis street violence. Maybe, just maybe, it's the commercial electronic music that's played in some of the vast clubs that have proliferated to corral the under-25s like a pen of battery chickens with an Alco-Pops problem. The focus is always on the availability of alcohol and herding a critical mass of hormonally charged youth under the one roof, but never on what's happening to them once they're in there, or, most importantly, on what music is being played. It's fascinating how the power of music is underestimated. How people think any CD will do, when the fact is that music can do pretty much anything except make coffee and take out the rubbish on Tuesday nights. How many brides are there out there scarred for life because the DJ at their wedding, the biggest day of their lives, insisted on playing ambient trance or Swedish metal? Something like that can ruin your life. It's interesting to note that the most effective torture method that the American army had at their disposal during the War on Terror, beside getting menstruating female soldiers to put copies of the Quran down their knickers in front of male Muslim detainees, was music. Bet that's a sentence you never thought you'd hear. Now, as early as May 2003, the BBC reported that the US Army had used Metallica's Enter Sandman and Barney the Purple Dinosaur's I Love You in the interrogation of Iraqi detainees, playing the songs repeatedly at a high volume inside of shipping containers. Guantanamo detainees were chained to the floor and forced to listen to extremely loud rap music, sometimes to Eminem and Dr. Dre for 20 days straight. A 2005 issue of Time magazine included a story based on a Mohammed al-Khatini's interrogation over a 3-month period. His interrogations began at midnight, and whenever he dozed, he was awakened either by water being poured over his head or the sound of Christina Aguilera's music. He could have been hanging out on King Street. Now, according to physician and neurologist Oliver Sacks, who wrote The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat and Musicophilia, the human brain is hardwired to respond to music. It's intrinsic in a way that written language, or a love of strong blue cheese, for example, isn't. Those things, like racism or barracking for Collingwood, need to be learned. But music is just in us. We use it to relax, to fire ourselves up for battle, or when we want to be simply the best for a rugby final. We protest through song. We learn best when information is set to music. If we worship a god, then we use music to shift into a place of grace and sing his praises. If we don't worship a god, we just listen to Jeff Buckley singing Hallelujah instead and wonder what that weird lumpy feeling in our chests is. We use music to wallow in and release grief when we're mourning or relationship or death. We use music to buck ourselves up. We meditate to music. We're thoroughly impressed with whales because they sing. Musical comedy is nearly, always, somehow, funnier and more effective than straight stand-up. And a certain sad type of ironic retro male with satin sheets and an automatic dimmer on the lights will still whack on Barry White's Can't Get Enough of Your Love Baby when he wants to bust a move with a pretty lady, if you get my drift. In studies on age gap relationships, it's been determined that the major underlying cause of breakup in relationships with a 10-year or more age gap is lack of compatibility in music taste. It's pretty obvious. You know, if one partner keeps ejecting their honey's Duran Duran and Jam CDs and replacing them with a boxed collection of the Grateful Dead, it's going to make for some frosty long-distance driving. And at UK tube stations, and I believe at Footscray and other western suburbs train stations, they're currently playing classical music to deter street gangs from loitering. Don't ever think that music is irrelevant. Think how when you go out, the difference between a top night and one when you're cranky as Jermaine Gier in a size 8 G-string depends on the music. I couldn't count the bars I've turned on my heel and walked out of because they're playing too loud, shitty music. And by shitty, I don't mean Justin Bieber or Nickelback or Cold Chisel or whatever insert intense personal dislike you indubitably have here. That's just taste. I'm talking that set and forget, lazy, generic, thumping commercial electronic music that the large clubs pump out like they've popped the seal on an underwater oil well. Now I want to be clear here, it isn't that all electronic music is rubbish, not at all. Some house music is excellent, and DJs don't get flown around the world and paid 10 or 20 grand a pop to be rubbish. Festivals where electronic music predominates can have a beautiful energy about them. However, that's not what gets played at most commercial nightclubs. It's mostly joyless, sausage meat, cheap, mass-produced music that's played in the clubs. It's too uninteresting to actually listen to, but far too loud to be background music, in one stroke, providing the worst of both worlds. There are a few things at work here. One is having a backdrop of loud, repetitive electronic music, which is a very different experience to listening to a live band, which demands human interaction because there are actual humans on stage. This, to be fair, is open to interpretation with Slipknot. Also, most electronic music, no matter how fabulous, tends to take the listener on an internal rather than an external journey. It's optimally listened to while under the influence of any of several party drugs manufactured in a bathtub, and ushers you into a self-absorbed dancing trance. It's all about you, which is fine if you're at an eco-rainbow rave and lost in a sea of dreadlocks. But the reason young people head into city centres every weekend, like a river of frisky, spawning salmon nosing their way upstream, is to socialise with other young, frisky people, with an eye to spawn. To connect, to check each other out, to flirt, to pick up, to get jiggy, as it has ever been and as it ever will be. And since the dawn of time, music has always been an integral part of the mating and dating ritual as hormones and low self-esteem. And the music, my friends, has shifted more in the past 30 years than an Antarctic ice shelf. There are now two major musical speed humps in the path of hooking up. Most underrated and unheralded has been the loss of partner dancing, which evaporated in the 60s when the boomers discovered pot, acid and self-expression. Talk about throwing the baby out with the bong water. Now, the loss of partner dancing is like a loss of frogs or small marsupials from an ecosystem. It may not seem like a big deal in terms of the big picture, but it has long-reaching effects that aren't noticed until it's too late. For centuries, millennia, partner dancing, whether it was to Glenn Miller or lute and madrigal, allowed young, nervous adults to get to know each other through non-sexual, fun, social, ritualised touching. It's always been there. It always used to be controversial as well. The waltz was considered scandalous for about 2 centuries. And there hasn't been a partner dance invented where Christians didn't insist that there was room for Jesus between the partners. Some friends of mine learned ballroom at school, and the teacher solved the problem of direct contact by making them hold a vinyl record between their groinal regions. Nothing's going to get through that, although it did lead to some unfortunate jokes, which ended with the punchline, about 12 inches. Partner dancing makes it okay for young people to touch each other in a codified, non-sexual way, and it's a terrible thing that it has disappeared. Until the 1970s, it was the predominant way in which people hooked up. Now, I'm sorry to put the image of your parents hooking up in your brains, but it did happen. Probably on a dance floor. You talk to old people about how they met, and there's always a great story. You know, we met at a dance. I was going off to war the next day, and I didn't know if I was ever coming home. I saw Beryl across the dance floor. They're always called Beryl. She had a red gardenia in her hair, and I thought she was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, and I knew in that moment I'd marry her. You know, these days Beryl would be called Tiffany, wearing a porn star t-shirt, and she'd be willing to fillet you in the toilet. Now, it's much worse for guys than women. Oh, well, maybe not because of the fellation, but because you'd have to encase a woman in concrete to stop her dancing. For men, though, free-form dancing is much scarier than partner dancing, where there were definite rules and moves which they could learn and master. Men like being in control and they like knowing what they're doing. They're concerned if they take to the dance floor now that they're going to look like dickheads. The option of taking a lady's hand and busting out some Lindy Hop or Foxtrot is long gone, and the degree of difficulty of connecting with a significant other has ratcheted up 10 degrees to the level of, dude, it's easier to stay home and download porn. And then there's commercial electronic music. It's pretty much the ultimate anti-romance music. It's played loud, it's repetitive, it's not fun, it's unremarkable and unmemorable. You're never going to be able to go, "Ooh, remember when we met to that song?" Even if you can make yourself heard over the top, it gives you nothing to talk about and appears to be the first music ever created by humankind which bypasses the emotions. Because it's electronic, there's no inherent human engagement. Again, fine, if your aim is to dance like a maniac until 6 a.m. or whenever you start coming down, but truly terrible if you're not on chemicals. Which does remind one of that joke. What did one electronic music fan say to the other when their ecstasy failed to kick in? Gee, this music's crap. So, the clubs are chock full of young folk who are desperate for connection, but who can't talk to each other, can't touch each other without it being interpreted as a sexual come-on, have zero opportunity for intimacy, and can only dance in their own little world and hope that someone's looking at their booty. The only tools in their seriously denuded seduction kit are alcohol and shouting, and basically crossing their fingers that someone will get drunk enough to come home with them. This is not an optimum method. So yet another night ends, they're disconnected, unsatisfied and frustrated, back on the streets and totally, utterly hammered. Gee, I wonder why there's so much aggression and street violence. It's impossible to bring back partner dancing overnight, but playing almost any other kind of music would reduce street violence. A live band would be good. Playing anything with some kind of joy, engagement and content would help. Doesn't matter if it's disco, funk, yacht rock, indie pop, Mongolian throat singing, gypsy punk, neo-lounge or Latin, so long as it's not joyless thumping background music. Maybe siphon off some funds into retraining some officers into being disco police. Then instead of having to contain and arrest drunk, frustrated young men, they could bust into clubs a couple of times a night, force the DJ to put on the goddamn Jackson 5's I Want You Back, and watch the happiness commence. Back in the day, when I could be asked working until 3 a.m, I used to do a fair whack of DJing pubs and clubs, and violence was rare to the point where I can remember each incident individually. I can guarantee you this: a man who has danced to the Weather Girls' It's Raining Men is not one who leaves the venue and glasses someone in the face. Just saying.